because now he couldn't reach up with his arms. He tried to slide back down, but was rather wedged. After several minutes, Neil shouted up to the men, "I'm stuck. I can't budge an inch." Bob made his way back down into the treacherous corkscrew and could only see Neil's helmet inside the lower shaft. It was clear that he was wedged in a narrow part of the pathway and that they would need to pull him up. He headed back up, and the rest of the men gathered to heave up on the rope ladder, hoping to pull Neil through this tight squeeze. They felt a little movement on the ladder, then it was firmly taut without any further movement up. It became clear that the boulder had completely wedged in the shaft and held the ladder tightly in place. Neil had been pulled upwards a foot or so, but he was no less wedged than he was before. His body was trapped in the elliptical tunnel that led down from the corkscrew. The men shouted back and forth to figure out his status. Several attempts were made to slide down to reach him, but he was stuck in this tiny shaft. The ladder would be of no use to them now, and Neil was in an impossible situation. His feet dangled just above a rung on the ladder, and his knees couldn't be bent far enough to allow him to raise his foot to the next rung up. He had absolutely nowhere to gain leverage in the smooth shaft, so he was simply stuck without the ability to assist his friends in rescuing him. On Neil's way down into the shaft, he had angled his shoulders to fit down into the small alcove below. Now he was being pulled straight up, wedging his broad shoulders into the narrow space, with no chance to pass in this angle. After the failure with pulling the ladder, they decided to climb down and loop a rope around him to pull him out directly. The safety rope they had set up initially wasn't really made to pull against the sharp rock and crevices that it was getting stuck in. Each pull ended in failure, with the rope getting wedged and eventually snapping in two. It took an hour or so of effort for the men to accept that they would need some additional help and supplies. 17-year-old Bob Toogood headed out, back to the entrance of the cave, to run over to a nearby farm where caver friends lived. He notified them to call the police, and to call down to the youth hostel in town to get local cavers up to help. Bob collected long nylon rope from Whiteley Farm and made the 2-hour trek back through the many tight crawls and water-filled sections, through the eye hole, and up the incline with hundreds of feet of rope. This was no easy task, but as soon as he made it back, he was directed to take a loop of rope down to Neil and place it around his body to pull him up. Bob was a small guy and had already been down in the shaft a few times himself. Once he passed through the corkscrew jog in the shaft, he found himself in a difficult position. He could lower himself down on the ladder, but could not bend down to reach Neil's head and shoulders. Neil was wedged tight, and getting a rope around his body was going to be quite difficult, even if he had all the room in the world. In this case, he would be limited to a few strained movements, and Neil was unable to really assist him in any way. Neil was stunned. Having the ladder as a lifeline felt like there would be a safe way to escape, no matter how daunting the little elliptical hole seemed. Now that the metal rung was wedged tight against his body, keeping his arms from being free, he was terrified with the claustrophobic feeling of being trapped. It was like being rolled in a blanket, with Big Brother refusing to free you. Looking up, he could only see the narrow walls of the hole above, with no room for a second person to really come down to help him. The strain on Neil was starting to show. He had been down in this shaft for nearly 4 hours, and it was clear that he was starting to suffer some delusion. Bob and the men above were discussing the options of how to get a hold on Neil so they could pull him out.